Hey, Vitalik.
Hello.
Hey, there you are.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Vitalik, for joining today. It's a real honor to talk to you. One of the main movers of my generation. We're actually just 6 months apart in age, so I can look at you as a peer in some ways, but you're also leading a lot of important change in the world. So before we really get started, I'd like to just know where you're calling in from today.
Well, I'm in Singapore right now. The Ethereum Foundation has a base in Singapore, so I end up spending some time here.
I assume you're not traveling quite as much now, but usually you're a bit of a digital nomad, right?
Yeah.
Do you go places that are kind of, just familiar or places that you're most excited about? Like Singapore obviously is a little bit different.
hmm
Did you choose it for any particular reason to be the Ethereum headquarters?
I think for the Ethereum Foundation headquarters, that we're looking for places that have a lot of infrastructure, have a friendly legal environment, and all other things that a crypto foundation needs. We have a base in our kind of main base in Switzerland and we set up this one in Singapore as well a couple of years ago. So those are and it's basically just kind of convenient to do things out of both as or either one as a foundation. And then in terms of where I go, and there's a few different cases. There's sometimes I get invited to places for conferences. Sometimes I get invited to play places because there's Ethereum communities there, and sometimes it's things other than Ethereum. So like I work with the Radical Exchange, for example, and sometimes kind of things that go even further out. Sometimes it's just kind of meeting with people in our community. So, and then sometimes trying to kind of go and meet new communities. So, for example, last year I spent about a week and a half in Africa. And I guess I go to a lot of places for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I'm pretty interested in places like Africa in particular that have not been so much of a part of the global stage
Mm.
for so long, but seem primed for very fast, accelerated development. Are you seeing signs of a lot of promise there?
Definitely. And I think there's definitely been a lot of very rapid development going on in many places in Africa. And there's lots of Africans getting connected to the internet, trying to join global business communities, and a lot of entrepreneurship happening, a lot of people just trying to build their communities up. It's definitely there's definitely a kind of excitement and energy that you can see clearly every time you go there.
And it's interesting. I mentioned before the podcast that I didn't want to focus on crypto, and I certainly won't. I think there's a lot of that content with you out there already, and I'd like to talk about some of the other really interesting things you work on. Having said that, I was looking the other day out of curiosity at Google Trends for the term Bitcoin, and I
Mhm.
actually used it as a way of projecting a valuation that speculating upon what the price might hit the next time the Google trend for the term Bitcoin reaches levels similar to or surpassing the 2017 high. And
Mhm.
in doing so, I saw that Nigeria is pretty much blowing every other country out of the water in terms of their search, not obviously in terms of gross, but in terms of um, as a country, they're searching for it more now than ever to a higher degree than any other country. Is that a country in particular that you spent a lot of time in?
I actually haven't been to Nigeria yet. The places in Africa I've been to so far are Kenya, South Africa, and Zambia. And South Africa is obviously an economic center for the place, for the continent. Kenya is too. Nigeria as well, and Nigeria has about 1/6 of the population of Africa, which is something that even like, I didn't know up until a few weeks ago. There's definitely strong Ethereum communities in Nigeria as well, and I know people from the Ethereum Foundation are closely in touch with the people from Nigeria. We had a hackathon in Cape Town last year, and there were people from definitely quite a few African countries coming in there. So I mean, I'm not surprised. Like, there's definitely real value that crypto can provide to people in Africa, and even just like very simple stuff. Like, for example, there's a lot of people there who who have skills and who wants to work remotely for software companies in more developed countries, but they sometimes have a hard time getting the money back home, and crypto just provides an incredibly convenient way of doing that. So there's really simple things like that, and then there's various kinds of smart contract applications. So it's some of everything. The interest is definitely real, I guess.
So you mentioned some of your travels are for meetings related to Radical Exchange. My understanding is that's a community of activists and others focused on pretty radical social change, obviously for the better from their perspective and probably from yours, I'm assuming. Could you talk a little bit about your involvement there and what the efforts of the organization are going towards?
Sure. So I guess the way that I would describe Radical Exchange is that it's this in a very interdisciplinary effort at a kind of very concrete and kind of applied social and political philosophy. So combining together kind of humanities style thinking together with very kind of rigorous mathematical and economic thinking to try to kind of create new and better institutions to help people cooperate, essentially, right? So it's looking at reforming how markets work, or it's looking at reforming how democracy works, how systems of property rights work. So probably three of the core ideas that Radical Exchange has become known for. One is this idea called Harbinger Taxes, which is basically an alternative form of property ownership. So basically the way that Harbinger Taxes work is that if you have a piece of property that's Harbinger taxed, then essentially you have to provide some price at which you're willing to sell that property, and you pay a property tax every year or every whatever period it is based on that price, right? So you might imagine like this being used for pieces of land, for kind of intellectual property, copyrights and patents, for even kind of fairly esoteric things like allocations of like spectrum broadcasting rights. And the problem that Harbinger Taxes are trying to solve is basically that if we look at how property rights normally work today, right, where if you have something, then you have this kind of, at least in theory, sort of infinitely strong claim on it, right? Like nobody else can kind of grab it off of you, no matter without your approval, no matter how much how hard they try. And the problem is that, and like on the one hand, there's very valuable and good things that come out of this, but on the other hand, it sometimes creates these monopoly problems. Well, so there's two kinds of problems. Like there's what's called monopoly problems. There's what's called holdout problems. So one example of this might be that, like, imagine like you are trying to build like something. It could be some kind of high-speed public transit thing. It could be basically something where you need to just get a lot of permission from a huge number of people. And then the challenge is basically that if what you actually end up needing to do is you need to end up kind of buying each and every one of those individual people's property. Then basically you have a huge number of people, and each one of those people know that they individually can stop you from completing your entire project, right? And so even if you get 90% of people's permission and you've already sunk a lot of money into it, the incentive that each of the remaining 10% have is to just start charging huge amounts, because they know that basically you have no choice but to pay up, right? If you don't pay the price that they charge, then you basically lose all of the investments that you put into your project. And this could easily lead to huge inefficiencies that just prevent entire projects from happening, right? And like this is probably the main reason why land property systems tends to have some form of eminent domain. So they tend to have some form of rule that says that, for some specific functions, if governments can just go and take the land and pay some standard market rate for it. And this is a basically more kind of open and democratized version of this of the same thing that basically kind of restructures the entire property market in such a way that it's more basically people have an incentive to charge prices that more closely reflect the market value of something, instead of reflecting some kind of really high extortionate price where they try to extract as much value as possible for themselves at the expense of everyone else. So that's Harbinger taxes. Another interesting one is quadratic voting. This is this idea that instead of limiting people to one vote, you allow people to kind of purchase multiple votes, except every vote that you purchase costs more than the previous one, right? So your first vote costs $1, the second vote costs $2, the third vote costs $3, and so forth. And the core kind of mathematical idea behind this is basically that it tries to measure not just what option you like better, but also how much you care about a decision, right? The idea basically being the more you care about a decision, the more votes you're going to be willing to buy, basically the more you'll be willing to keep on buying votes until the price of a vote gets too high for you. And as a result of this, basically you get this voting system that kind of solves a lot of the problems that you see in traditional voting systems, right? Kind of tyranny of the majority, the one sheep and two wolves of voting for what's for dinner kind of problem. So these are just examples, but the broader idea is basically that there's a lot of kind of very rigorous kind of mathematical economic thinking behind why each of these ideas might be good. And there's also a lot of deep kind of humanistic and social thinking around, what kinds of ideas would people accept, what kinds of ideas would be effective at dealing with some of the complexities of society that are more difficult to mathematically model, and all of those things. So this whole project was started by Glenn Weil, as this economist. He wrote this book a few years ago called Radical Markets. And so on my blog of Vitalik.ca, if you just scroll down to Radical Market and just Control F for Radical Markets, I wrote this big kind of review on the book. And then from there, it kind of blossomed into this organization, and now it has chapters around the world, and some of the mechanisms that it's promoting are being kind of actively tested and implemented in a lot of different contexts. So a lot of interesting things happening there.
I appreciate the broad overview, and sounds like a book that I might be interested in reading. Just to dig in on the two main points that you spoke about a little bit without spending too much time on them. The Harbinger taxes that you brought up, I'm less familiar with that than the quadratic voting that you spoke about. So I'd like to just make sure my understanding's right and ask you a question related to that. So basically, you brought up the example of a public transport system. I might, I had time to think while you were speaking about it. I might also bring up something like a casino, a sports arena, and in a less tangible way, I've actually thought about kind of what you described as, one person having exorbitant power based on their ability to disrupt the whole, plan, for lack of a better word. And I've thought about that in relation to like major movies or TV series. So like Game of Thrones, for instance. And I don't know exactly how these things work, but it never seems to be too big of an issue. But I always wonder why, the actor Kit Harington, who plays Jon Snow, he could theoretically ask for a whole lot more money for season 6 and 7 than he could in the beginning when he was basically undiscovered and probably had no leverage. So I don't know how they take care of those things, but something like a Harbinger tax, that's not a property of his other than his own time necessarily. But
Right.
is that kind of the flaw in the system that it's trying to solve from a property perspective?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a good analogy. And there's definitely a lot of reasons why I would recommend not kind of harbinger taxing people, because that would basically mean kind of potentially forcing people to do work even if they don't want to, which seems kind of not very nice. But if we start thinking about like physical objects and of lands and even copyrights and patents tends to be just like huge sources of inefficiency, more abstract kinds of assets. Like, it basically is that type of problem.
And is there a zone of applicability for this type of thing? Because the first thing when you mentioned it before you brought up the example, which made a lot of sense to me, was
Mhm.
just the most simple property that I can think of is someone's house.
Mhm.
So if I have a house and say it's worth $1 million, and uh, by the way you described it, my understanding is, I price it at $1 million. That's what I believe it's worth and what I would be willing to sell it at. And it's
Mhm.
actually up for sale through this mechanism at that price. And so I'm paying taxes based on $1 million property value. Um, my choices are basically, if I really love this house and I've been here for 20 years, my choices are basically to price it or to value it at or to offer it for sale, kind of at all times at a sort of unreasonable price, and by virtue of that, paying kind of an unfair or unreasonable tax. Because and I do value it highly, but I'm basically just trying to prevent anyone else from buying it versus pricing it fairly, in which case, theoretically, a lot of people, anyone who wants to move to my area or needs to move to my area for one reason or another is going to see this fairly priced home. And I kind of have to live in constant fear that my property is going to be taken from me at a fair price or slightly over fair price. Is that something that
No,
the mechanism takes into consideration?
that's definitely a fair critique. I think like, if you asked Glenn, he could give reasons for why that's kind of not likely to be a big problem in practice. Like if you even set your price kind of 15% over, then like unless someone wants to kind of explicitly be really mean to you, they're not like they're going to see a whole bunch of other houses that are priced more cheaply and buy those first and so forth. But like if you're not convinced by that sort of thing, this is a big reason why. And if while people's houses are kind of a very iconic example to use when thinking about how harbinger taxes would work, they're definitely not anywhere close to one of the first 10 things that um, radical exchange would recommend harbinger taxes actually being used for. So like if we're talking about lands property, then other examples might be rural lands property. There might also be kind of commercial land, so land on major streets that's being used for businesses that where people tends to have less kind of personal attachment to, or I mean, people have personal attachments to their businesses, but they're generally more willing to kind of move them a kilometer down the street if they have to.
Mm-hmm.
And then also less tangible things like, as I mentioned, like copyrights. Like copyrights are just a huge kind of mine of just horrible inefficiency, right? Because there's a lot of content that people like potentially could be used kind of as part of other content. So like potentially a lot of images that could be used as part of other works, music that could be included as soundtracks to other things and so forth. And the problem is that our copyright system, of course, is that basically it's like everything is copyrighted by default, and you have to ask for kind of permission by default. And if you can't find the person, then if you're a risk averse organization, then you're just not going to be able to use it at all, and that just doesn't ends up benefiting no one. So the idea there, like you could imagine a Harbinger tax system for copyright that says something like, first, like in order to have copyright on something, you have to register it, and you have to put up a buyout price, and you have to pay, let's say, 3% of the buyout price every year, right? But then for anyone can come along, and if they're willing to pay you whatever that buyout price is, then they get the kind of full ability to do whatever they want with that copyright, including licensing it to other people or whatever. Like I think now, to be fair, I think, and to prevent people from losing control of their own stuff, like I think it would be better for it to not be a buyout. It would be better for it to say, like if I register a thing and I register it at $1,000, and then you go and pay me, then you have the right to do whatever you want with that thing as though it's public domain, but then I also still have that right. So that, like, you could imagine kind of that kind of system, like basically forcing people to, both kind of register and all of the copyrighted stuff in kind of one central source, and give people confidence that if something's not on there, then they can just go and take it, but also that kind of forcing people to think hard about like how much they actually value, and of excluding people from being able to use that particular work, and if that's something they don't highly value, then they're not going to just kind of lock society out of it just because they're lazy. So that's another example. A third example that's kind of topical, that might be interesting, is zoning, right? So zoning is interesting because it's this kind of complicated collection of these kind of partially strong property rights. Like basically, people have these kinds of weak interests in basically what gets built on land that's close to them. So like, for example, if some really tall building gets built close to your property, that might block out the sun, that might and potentially like cause more congestion, it might lead to more noise, and a whole bunch of things. And so these interests are kind of strong enough that it makes sense to have some kind of mechanism where if you want to build something like that, you have to get permission from more than just the property owner. But at the same time, you don't want to have a strong property rights system in the other direction, where in order to build an apartment building, you have to literally get permission from every single property holder within 1,000 meters, because that would lead to kind of the holdout problems we talked about earlier, right? And zoning tends to be this kind of historic compromise, and it tends to involve fairly complicated kind of procedures, and it's difficult to figure out how to participate in, and it's hard to kind of justify some of the specific things that are being done. And more recently, there's been a lot of discussion of like aren't a whole bunch of these rules like basically just designed to kind of keep some racial groups out of a whole bunch of regions. So basically, it's this kind of just really nasty form of obfuscated racism and all of this stuff. And so, if we think of some combination of like Harbinger taxes, quadratic voting, kind of some kind of more sort of fluid system for basically balancing these different interests, and kind of acknowledging those interests, but also kind of acknowledging that some of those interests usually matter more than others, then you could see that improving things a lot as well, right? So and then the other one that Glenn talks about as a very short-term thing, as I mentioned, is spectrum, right? So this is basically just like the right to broadcast at particular frequencies. And this is something where we've just historically had really inefficient auctioning mechanisms for. And so if you want to use some particular band of frequencies, then often you have to kind of buy the rights up from different people, and the markets for this tends to just not work very well at all. And so Glenn's been recommending a Harbinger tax-based solution for basically doing this better. So there's some examples.
Yeah, those are all great examples, and definitely help me to understand it more, and hopefully others as well. It sounds like something that certainly makes a ton of sense in a ton of instances. And I'm sure there's nuanced points to be figured out, whether it's only applying the taxes to certain areas or, incorporating a premium of some sort for personal properties like someone's house. I'm sure there's a lot of ideas going around, and it sounds like you guys have a lot of smart minds working on it. So I hope to see it applied to some of the more sensible areas like copyrights, like you mentioned, sooner than later, and hopefully make some better systems. I want to stay on the topic of radical change, but move away from Harbinger taxes and quadratic voting, which I would have discussed, but frankly, I'd rather talk about some other things. And there's some great content on that on Eric Weinstein's podcast with you that I'd recommend anyone go listen to. So staying on the topic of radical change, I'd like to talk about your involvement with life extension. My first episode on the podcast was with Aubrey de Grey, pretty much the pioneer of that space. Had some ideas that he made public in 2000 and wrote a book several years later called Ending Aging, which I think we've both read. I'm a believer that he has far better than a non-zero chance of seeing his theories come to fruition to some extent. He talks about longevity escape velocity, which is the idea that basically if we can figure out how to turn back the aging clock by 30 years or something like that for people and turn, a 60-year-old into a 30-year-old biologically, that'll buy enough time to figure out how to get another 20 years from then or something like that. And theoretically, as long as we maintain a pace of being able to rewind a year for every year on average that we advance forward as humanity, will be able to theoretically live forever in terms of, there's accidents and threats of nuclear war and artificial intelligence and all of that. But from an aging perspective, he sees it as something that could be conquerable. I take a bit of a more conservative lens to it just because I'm not as familiar with it and can't be as confident, but I do see things a lot differently than the common person in terms of how long I would expect to live, barring any of those other sorts of non-aging related disasters or even just more simpler diseases that aren't really associated with aging. So would love to hear your thoughts on the space, how you came to get involved, and hopefully we can go from there.
Yeah, so I read Aubrey's book when I was quite young. I think it was when I was somewhere in between 10 and 13 years old. My dad bought it. He recommended it to me. And that definitely kind of radicalized me very early on. I definitely kind of very quickly saw the potential. I was very excited about the possibility of this kind of progress happening. And to me, kind of the concept that we could just have people, not die after a century seemed amazing, and it seemed like something we should obviously be putting a huge amount of resources into if we can. So that's probably how it started, and I kind of continued following along the topic. I kind of did a project around this anti-aging for a science class in high school, and then it just kind of stayed as something on the back of my mind as something that I consider valuable, and though at the same time don't really have a way to contribute to myself because at the time I had very little money, and I was definitely nowhere close to being a biologist. And so then a few years later, I was doing Ethereum, and crypto prices were all going up. The ETH price was going way up, and kind of financially, Ethereum and all of the people in Ethereum were doing really well. And I started doing my kind of first rounds of charity donations. So the ones I went to, a lot of them were kind of standard effective altruist picks. So I gave quite a bit to the Against Malaria Foundation, quite a bit to Give Directly, some other kind of global poverty themed ones, like I think it was the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, quite a bit to MIRI, the AI research organization as well. And also kind of put Aubrey's Sens Foundation in there too, basically because Aubrey is just has been this kind of a long time hero of mine, and it just seemed naturally obvious that if we could cure aging, then we could basically save 50 million lives every year, and this is possibly one of the most important problems in the world. And here's an opportunity to make a significant nudge toward how quickly that problem gets solved at a surprisingly low cost. And so donated some money, then ETH rose again, then donated some more money. I finally ended up meeting Aubrey. I think it was in 2017. Had some very nice chats, so that was really nice. And then I guess, since that point, my kind of relationship to longevity has been kind of part funding some longevity organizations and part just kind of being an advocate in whatever way I can.
Right. And both of these things tend to come hand in hand in terms of public attention, driving public support, driving funding, public and private, I suppose. So, and obviously you have this large platform as well as substantial funding from Ether to be able to impact both, which I think is awesome. And as far as I can see, you are pretty much the guy there, which, there should be more from my perspective. And that's basically because, like you said, this should be a very cost-effective solution to a large, to death, essentially. Not all death, but age-related death, which spans a number of diseases that are receiving just massive amounts of funding: cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, across the board. Go ahead.
COVID-19, I was saying.
Yeah, COVID-19. I have something interesting I'd like to talk about there, but before going the COVID route, it's interesting, and I think I've heard you mention this in the past in an interview, which is that even if we were to cure cancer and basically mitigate heart disease where it's not killing people either, most research suggests that would add 5, 6, 7, 8 years to the average human lifespan worldwide. But something like, reversing aging by 20 years, that's just like a one-shot solution that pushes all of this stuff further down the road and kicks the can down the road. So it doesn't make any sense to me, and I would presume you agree to some extent that, and not that these other diseases don't deserve large funding, they certainly do, but aging just is totally underfunded in that sense, in that, even if you say it has a 1 or 2% probability that Aubrey's strategy or like strategies could work out, the impact is so many times, degrees of magnitude more than solving one specific cancer or even cancer as a whole. Is that something that you sympathize with and are trying to, is that part of what motivates your bringing this to the public eye?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I hope it's working. And like I said, I think I haven't seen anyone who's been more vocal about it from outside of the space itself. People like Aubrey, David Sinclair, who wrote the book recently, Laura Deming out in San Francisco. But it's, I like to see what you're doing, and hopefully I can contribute as well. It's cool that when you were younger, you looked up to Aubrey and saw him as a hero and wanted to contribute, but didn't know how. And already, 10 years later, you can. I can't contribute too much monetarily yet myself, but hopefully having people in the space on this podcast, from Aubrey to large donors and advocates like yourself to others in the space, I'll be able to do my small part.
I think we're going to see more and more advocacy of life extension coming for in the near future. Like, I think one of the things that I've been kind of seeing recently is the growth of this new kind of techno progressive movement. So basically, it's this kind of an ideological, cultural, and to some extent political movement that's basically seeing kind of this stagnation that's been happening in the economy and society. Maybe is somewhere between over the course of the last kind of 30 or so years as just being this really big problem that everyone is kind of underestimating, and just basically realizing that we need to get back to kind of valuing progress and technology as forces for good. Like one example of this is if we look at sci-fi in the last 50 years ago versus sci-fi in the last 20 years, right? Like 50 years ago, we had things like Star Trek, and we had Captain Kirk with all of his kind of high-minded values of peace and freedom and human rights and universal love and all of these things, but together with that, the starships and the warp drives and the replicators. But a lot of the sci-fi in the last 20 years, like, it really completely fails to kind of show any kind of good consequences coming out of technology, right? Like you have, like shows like Altered Carbon, and like Altered Carbon seems to be just convincing people that life extension is actively bad because it'll lead to just rich people having it and using it as a way to lord over everyone else, which just completely isn't true if you kind of understand at all how these kind of treatments and even medical procedures historically have gone. But you have Altered Carbon, you have Black Mirror, you have even just a lot of the most other more recent sci-fis. They tend to kind of play up these dystopian aspects. And there's definitely things that are legitimately worth worrying about in technology, but in general, there's definitely this kind of mindset that's permeated society that basically just says that technological progress in general is just something that's not that worth being excited about, and let's just kind of stay roughly where we are now. Now, there is sci-fi like that kind of is the exception to this, and actually ironically enough, when someone challenged me to come up with exceptions, the first one I came up with was this movie, The Wandering Earth, which unsurprisingly came out of China, right? So basically this techno-progressive movement tries to say, in the world, in both kind of the West in particular and for the world in general, that we can and should see technological progress as this kind of source of goodness and this kind of bright light that humanity can kind of look forward to, and possibly even something that could unify us in these increasingly divided times. And life extension is one of the big prizes that we can get really excited about. And there's other prizes to get excited about too. So, like, for example, I thought, the fact that a few months ago, in the middle of probably kind of the strongest phase of when all of the protests were happening, and there were a lot of people yelling at each other and online and offline, and just in the middle of this, you had SpaceX just kind of launch their rocket and up to the space station, and this was just one of the few things that a huge number of people from all sorts of different sides could just get excited about it and unite behind. And I mean, space travel is definitely also one of these kind of dreams where, we kind of remember how, 50 years ago we went to the moon somehow, and 2 years ago it seemed impossible. Wait, how were we able to do this? This 50 years ago, we can't even do it today. And now it seems like kind of just going to space is something that's kind of getting back on track, right? So the broader idea that scientific and technological progress just can bring lots of these good and exciting things and provide just a hugely positive a positive value to humanity, and both including life extension and including other forms of transhumanism, and including like fusion, like different energy innovations, and other things as well. And this is something that I've been seeing more and more people start to much more strongly advocate for in a very coherent way.
Right, and you talk about the space launch that SpaceX and NASA were behind. I view people like Elon Musk and yourself. I look up to you guys because you view the future. You're very smart people, obviously, and aware much more so than the average person of all of the possible threats that do exist outside of what people might see in the movies. But you choose to take an optimistic view, not irrationally, but because theoretically there's still, multiple ways things can go, and people, especially who have accumulated some power and influence, like yourself and like Elon, can drive the future, or at least I like to think that, to a more positive place where we are, traveling through space, and we have a better system, a better financial system, maybe a better legal system, and things like that. And that brings me to another somewhat radical space that's gaining some momentum as far as I can tell. This one I'm newer to by a few years than the longevity space, and that's basically city building. And I understand you have some involvement there. My very fundamental overview of it is that basically, among other possible benefits, one of the core ones is that it would provide, and not just city building, but country building, either of which would, as long as they're able to function somewhat autonomously from any government that they may be under, they can basically experiment, which is what tech has done for years to inspire and promote innovation and affect innovation. And they can experiment and see success and see failure and just see what happens. And then larger countries can obviously take the hint, similar to what China did from Hong Kong years ago with their success, and hopefully make for a better world that way without having to radically experiment within large countries like the United States or China or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and city building is definitely something that I'm also very interested in. I'm definitely close to the Charter Cities Institute and Mark Lauder and those people. Definitely think it's very important work for pretty much the reasons that you that you said. Like, I think the other way of thinking about this is basically that, like, if we look at city governance as software, and it kind of is software, it's just running on hardware made up of people instead of code, then like software, sometimes you can upgrade software and sometimes you can make software better over time, but sometimes there just comes a time when you need to just kind of start with a clean slate and go start again from scratch and just kind of write up a new thing that immediately includes kind of all of the best practices that you know about, because getting to that point is actually easier than kind of taking an existing thing with all of its existing competing kind of interests and kind of accumulated junk and all of those things, and trying to kind of drag it to that ideal state. So this idea that let's just make new cities and with the best rules that we know about, and invite people to live in them is, I think, something that can definitely be very revolutionary for economic growth. It can be revolutionary for kind of empowering and preserving people's freedoms. It can be very, I think, eventually, valuable in kind of providing kind of lessons and experience, even for and kind of outside options, even for people who don't end up moving to those cities. So definitely strongly support.
And have you gone within that to the domain of seasteading? Are you familiar with that, where people are proposing we basically colonize the oceans? And I think there's a large uh, climate impact that they propose comes with that, or do you stick more on the governmental side?
And I've definitely followed the seasteading space. I think the challenge with seasteading is basically that it's one of those kind of you have to innovate in every kind of dimension at the same time sort of problems, right? Like you have to first come up with a way of guaranteeing that you're going to have, you know, some critical mass of, like, I don't know, what is it, like 1,000, 10,000 people all actually move and spend significant time in the place. Then you have to figure out everything about like what exactly a kind of house on the ocean looks like, how to kind of turn that into conditions that people would be happy kind of being in for long periods of time, figure out kind of legal issues. You know, even if you're theoretically kind of in international waters, you still have to very frequently trade with national waters. You still have to let people kind of come and go from countries. And then there's just the fact that it's a kind of completely different environment and lifestyle. So there's just a whole bunch of kind of different things that we have to do at the same time. I mean, maybe it'll happen. It'll definitely be really fun to see it happen. But in general, it's some like it's definitely not the easiest path. Whereas this kind of more moderate charter city route basically says, like, you know, it's not seeking full independence, it's only seeking kind of policy autonomy in a few key sectors. And because like that's just enough to realistically make kind of the reforms that people wants to make. And then you start with a small thing, going to verify that it works, and then try to make some more radical changes, make sure that works as well, and you keep going from there. So that more incremental approach, it does seem kind of a lower risk, and it does seem like it's something that could be more practically started in a shorter period of time. I mean, especially because like you can more realistically get people who aren't governance enthusiasts kind of actually moving over to a charter city, whereas with a seastead that ends up being much more difficult. But in the longer term, I could see both happening, and I could even see charter city and governance providing useful insights and examples to people trying to set up more radically independent communities at sea. We'll see.
Right. And theoretically, they should help one another out, unless, barring and really strong adverse reaction to seasteading, proposing something that's a little bit further radical, more radical might, help people become more comfortable with something like city building. At the same time, city building, like you said, it would hopefully be an incremental step towards trying some further down the line stuff. And the last kind of category that I wanted to talk with you about today, I know you're fairly passionate about the future of education. When I think about systems that are pretty broken, I think about financial, I think about governmental, healthcare, and education. And there's an analogy that I've referenced quite a bit in the past, where basically you think about school the way we have it now. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but basically think of it like a school for animals, and you've got all these different types of animals in there, and they all excel in their individual areas, but yet you're putting them all through the same classes and basically beating down people's interests and intellectual curiosities and not letting them thrive in the areas that they're best suited to thrive in. I personally took a gap year. I actually dropped out of school the same year as you, 2013, at the same age. I started a small online mobile gambling company that was, out of business within a year, and you started a $50 billion cryptocurrency. But all things the same, we both dropped out, and I've personally found that to be almost. I mean, I learned some stuff in school, obviously a lot, and I don't want to take anything away from that, but that was the beginning of my own individual education. That year spent pursuing my own interests, and I
Hmm.
basically did the same thing, quitting my job in investment banking after a couple of years post graduation, to get to where I am now, where I'm learning about these things like longevity and city building, and thinking about bigger issues that are just way more intriguing and interesting to me. So I'm a big proponent of untraditional education. I just had Ryan Delk on the podcast, who's trying to innovate on homeschooling. And I know you're basically self-taught in economics and philosophy, if not in part in mathematics, though I think you focused on that in school.
Hmm.
Would love to hear your thoughts on the future of education and how it may be able to be improved.
Mm. Yeah, education is definitely going through a lot of changes just because of the internet. And I think that's especially true if you kind of broaden your conception of what education is. Like, I think the traditional mindset is kind of treating education as being almost synonymous with a kind of structured program, like either a school or a university or something, like MOOCs that try to kind of replicate the format of a school of a school or university program. But if you think about it more broadly, kind of every book you read is education, and anything you learn on the job is education. The friends that you spend your time with are education. Blog posts and websites that you read are education. And in the rapidly changing world that we have, it's just not realistic to expect a kind of structured program that you spend like ages 18 to 24 or whatever in to teach you all of the specific things that you'll end up needing to know kind of going forward into the future, right? So, like one example of this is even just cryptography, right? So, and I'll admit, I learned a lot from my kind of 1 year at the University of Waterloo, and it was actually hugely productive. I learned a lot of linear algebra, which ended up being really important to my understanding of cryptography. I learned a lot of in kind of matrix kind of related math, and like linear algebra, combinatorics, computer programming languages, and it ended up being this really amazing and useful year. Though at the same time, I did kind of stay in touch with some friends who stayed in the university for kind of the whole 4 years or 5 years, whereas I dropped out after 1 year. And their impression was generally that the first year is more valuable than the future years, and so seems like I kind of went there for exactly the right amount of time, right? But after that, looking at cryptography, so okay, I have the basics. I know linear algebra. I know number theory. I understand what Fermat's theorem is and how our RSA works, and what polynomial rings are and all of this wonderful stuff. But then, I learned about this other thing called elliptic curve pairings. Nobody taught me how elliptic curve pairings work. Oh God, now I have to figure out what these things actually are and how they work. And figuring out how elliptic curve pairings work proves to be kind of devilishly hard. There weren't really good resources on it. And like understand, and then of course there were zero knowledge proofs, understand, and like ZK snarks in particular, understanding how those worked. Well, there was a bunch of papers, and academic papers are just horrible as an educational resource, right? Because they seem to be just kind of optimized for being read and reviewed by people who are very similar to the author. And so if you're coming at a subject from a different background, if you're coming at a subject from a kind of having taken a different path toward understanding the subject matter than the traditional path, then often enough you just see like a whole bunch of complicated formulas and Greek symbols and like talking about quotient rings and all sorts of stuff, and you get really intimidated. And then eventually, like, if you're lucky, so like myself, then there's people who you can talk to personally who kind of understand all of how all the stuff works, and they kind of do some explaining, and then you try to read things again, and then you try to implement it, and eventually you figure it out. But when you figure it out, you just realize, oh wow, it's like 10 times simpler than the way the paper explains it. Why couldn't the paper have explained it the easy way? Right. So one of the things that I have kind of dedicated myself to spending my time doing, probably even since early 2011 and 2012, when I was still doing a Bitcoin magazine, which is before Ethereum, is trying to kind of capture that niche of writing about complicated topics in such a way that is more understandable than these kind of really dense and incomprehensible academic papers, though at the same time more accurate than basically pop sci material, right? And on Vitalik.ca, I have all of these kind of articles and tutorials about how Z-case narcs work, how elliptic curve pairings work, how homomorphic encryption works, and how fast Fourier transforms work. And all of these topics are, like, in some cases they're hard because they're genuinely hard, but in some cases they were hard just because no one actually kind of cared deeply about just making an explainer for them that makes sense to people who are, kind of technically competent broadly, but haven't kind of gone down that exact same rabbit hole yet specifically, right? And like with that niche field, like I know there's a lot of people that just reach out and say, thank you, and we're very happy that these resources exist. So just like teaching people how completely new algorithms and completely new ideas work is also part of education, and it's something that is a kind of fundamentally very hard to institutionalize just because things are so fast moving, but it's something that I think humanity can easily get significantly better at, and it's something that kind of I try my best to be part of the process of humanity becoming significantly better at. So that's another thing, and I think and you've just kind of writing these explanations of topics with an eye toward understanding that there will be audiences that come at the topic from different angles and different levels of familiarity with specific areas. Just something that we could end up doing a lot more. So that's one area. Another, I think, aspect of online education that's challenging is that education has all of these functions that have to do with things other than kind of just directly learning, right? So, like for example, so first of all, like just reading is often not the best way to learn, right? Often the best way to learn is to actually try to implement something yourself. Also, there is a kind of motivation component. And if you go to an institution, then then the institution kind of provides the motivation component. It provides the schedule. It has you take tests once in a while, and you get a number that shows you how well you're doing in all of these things. And motivation is an aspect that kind of more naive efforts at education tend to underestimate. But at the same time, like there are ways of doing it, right? So if you look at like Duolingo, for example, like this application for learning languages, it helped me significantly when I was learning German, for example. And Duolingo actually, it has all of these kind of psychological techniques that kind of encourages you to kind of learn specific things with specific levels of spaced repetition between when you practice specific things, kind of encourages you to come back to it every day and so forth. And so that's another example of kind of ways that education technology can just end up making things significantly better. So, those are kind of some of the kind of biggest rabbit holes that I care about.
Yeah, that's great. That was plenty. I think we're not going to solve all of this in one podcast, but there was a lot of valuable perspective in there that I haven't heard from you elsewhere. And to your point about writing, I think speaking and podcasts, which are just so easily distributable and widely accessible, are another, valuable means, maybe not as precise as writing, but something which can help cue people off to different areas that they want to look deeper in and read about and talk with people about. So that was all very good.
Definitely.
Lastly, I'd like to end with one personal question and one philosophical. And I know I mentioned I'd have one question about crypto, but I think I'm actually going to be able to go without that. The personal question is, like I said, I'm 26 years old. You're 26 years old. You mentioned, growing up, it doesn't sound like you had a ton of money or a ton of, advantages. Obviously, it sounds like you had a dad who was interested in some interesting things and was able to expose you to them. But you very quickly catapulted from, a freshman at University of Waterloo to a world leader who a lot of people look up to in what's got to be somewhat surreal way. How is that from a, personally or emotionally, or I don't know what you want to call it, but what's it like to gain that world recognition? And also from a financial perspective, from my understanding, you don't care too much about money, which I think is awesome to have someone with a ton of money who doesn't very much care for it other than the power that it has to do good and their ability to allocate that. But I'd just be curious to hear your sort of candid perspective on what your life has been, especially in the last 10 years.
There's definitely kind of both good things and bad things. Like becoming more famous, for example, is one of those things that's like, it's really good up until a certain point, and there comes a point after which it starts rapidly becoming more bad than good. Like, this could just be a kind of I'm not sure if this applies to everyone or if it's an effect of my own personality specifically, but like, I'm the sort of person who tends to be, like very shy and introverted, and would have a very difficult time getting any friends at all if there weren't kind of sort of external reasons for people to care about me. And so that was definitely kind of one of the positive aspects at the beginning. But that's a kind of a fairly small hill, right? And kind of once you kind of get past that hill, then kind of the benefits of that kind of get up to a certain peak and then stay there. But then once you get to a higher level of fame, like one of the big challenges is that you lose privacy. Like, for example, especially at the peak of these bubbles, like if I were just to kind of go walk around outside in a city that's one of these kind of major tech centers, then roughly once every 10 kilometers, there's someone who kind of says hi to me and asks me for a picture or something like that. And that's the sort of thing that's kind of a novelty, like the first, like 10 or 20 times, but and after about 100 rounds, it definitely gets into the territory of like, hey, I just want to be a human being, and I want to have my life back. So that's one of the downsides, and there's definitely kind of a part of me that just hopes we don't have bubbles, I guess, for that reason. But no, I know that's not how things actually work. Aside from that, yeah, I don't know. It's like kind of a mix of a lot of different complicated things. Like, it's definitely a very different kind of life when you're kind of constantly focused on this big project, or focusing on doing things inside of this big project. Then when you're kind of just in university and the main thing that you care about is just like basically studying for for some exam and kind of living in your life in dread that you'll get that you'll make a mistake and that you'll get something much lower than you wanted to. Um, hmm. So there's good sides and there's downside, and there's bad sides as well.
And that's interesting you say that. It brings me to my last question. I'd like to know something. I know you've spent a good deal of time, correct me if I'm wrong, learning and thinking about philosophical things.
Hmm.
I'll offer, so I'd like to know one of your philosophical beliefs, or otherwise maybe just a question that you think about a lot in that territory. Um, Before I ask you, and I'll hopefully give you a little bit of time to think by sharing one of mine, which is going off the point you just said about fame having positive and negative aspects. I view pretty much without exception, although I'm always hesitant to say that, everything is as having positives and negatives associated with it, to the extent that I often find it helpful when seemingly bad things happen to me or in general to think about the fact that no one happening, no one event, no one thing uh, is really all bad or all good. There's a infinite number of impacts that come from that singular thing, and it would be impossible to understand all of them, thinking like the butterfly effect, something of that nature. And so, I'm not walking around when good things happen thinking, oh, this could be bad. You can make an argument that one should, but I mostly use it for my own benefit, that when something bad happens, I think, what good can come from this? And that's been very helpful to me. So I would love to know if you have a philosophical thought, related or totally unrelated, that maybe you haven't spoken about publicly before.
Um, I mean, one kind of, I guess, category of philosophical thing that I sometimes think about is like basically what motivates people to do bad things, and especially what motivates people to do bad things in kind of large scale contexts. Because like in our culture, we have, I think, like a lot of emphasis on like basically kind of cartoon villains, people who do kind of bad things because they're like kind of cartoonishly evil, like whether it's capitalists who only care about getting rich, whether it's the murderous expansionist empires of the 1940s, different kinds of kind of political villains, and all of these kind of other people. And this was kind of the model that I guess I was kind of implanted with when I was much younger, that there's just people who are just kind of plain evil. And when I started going around the world, and I started even kind of talking with some of these groups who I kind of had kind of even had some expectation or even had some kind of suspicion more of this type. Like it could be, in some cases it was banks, and in some cases other kinds of large corporations. In some cases it was governments, and I've definitely talked to a lot of governments on kind of both sides of pretty much every kind of geopolitical divide that kind of about. And like if you talk to people in person, right, like people in person are generally very nice to you. Like in the people running the multi-billion dollar corporations that you might accuse of exploiting people are going to be kind of in person nice to you, and the U.S. government people are going to be in person nice to you. Chinese government people are going to be in person nice to you, and so on and so forth. And so, like basically one of the ways that kind of challenged me is that like it seemed very hard to kind of think of all of these people as being kind of completely kind of two-faced or kind of duplicitous or kind of malicious in some ways, though at the same time, there are kind of actual bad things that are happening as a result of the behaviors a lot of the political actors and a lot of the corporate actors. And even kind of cryptocurrency itself, like, is ultimately about trying to create alternatives to, like, basically the harms that are done by these kind of centralized organizations, right, that are depriving people of basically kind of opportunities to transact outside of them. But then the model that kind of started to explain more things to me, that started to make more sense, is that a lot of kind of the nastiest things that people do, they don't so much happen because people are greedy, they happen because people are afraid, right? And this goes against what I think a lot of people kind of by default want to think, because people by default wants to kind of split the world into people who are just completely kind of unsympathetic and beyond any attempt to sympathize with them, and people who are normal. But the reality is that there is this spectrum, and people are often wildly inconsistent, and you see the same people who are very nice in person and very mean on the internet. You see people who are nice in person and nice on the internet and also do things that are just harmful to you or to things that you care about. And the thing that I noticed, and this is something I noticed even within kind of myself and even within the Ethereum community, right? So, like, if you remember the DAO fork, this was this incident when there was this big application that was running on Ethereum, and this application got hacked, and someone stole like $50 million from it. And we in the Ethereum community, of course, made this what's now relatively famous kind of DAO fork, right, where we basically just edited the rules of the Ethereum system in order and got everyone to agree to download clients that implemented these new rules that basically just kind of reversed the effects of that particular hack and gave everyone their money back. And when we did this, a lot of people were unhappy because it kind of went against the basic principles of immutability, went against the kind of basic principles of blockchains and being decentralized and all of this. But I didn't agree with those arguments, and a lot of people didn't agree with those arguments, but many people did. And so what those people did is they basically refused to download the client software that implements the new rules that reverse the theft, and instead they stuck with the original software. And so now you had two groups of people with two different sets of rules, and the people with the other set of rules kind of continued that blockchain, and they called themselves Ethereum Classic. And there was this really big scare, right, when basically Ethereum, what happened was the Ethereum Classic price started rising, and rising much higher than everyone expected. And at the same time as the Ethereum Classic price rose, the Ethereum price fell, right? So it started off as being like, ETH at 14, and then suddenly ETH dropped to 13.5 and ETC went up to 0.5, and then suddenly ETH went down to 11 and ETC went up to 3. And basically what happened was that people in the Ethereum community got scared, right? And they made arguments that were trying to kind of blame the entire, like, basically try to say, oh, ETC isn't even a real community. The whole thing is a psyop by Bitcoin people, which, there are definitely some Bitcoin people running around kind of trolling, but in reality, there were definitely people who just genuinely disagreed with us on the DAO fork issue. And there were even people advocating for us to just, actively destroy the Ethereum Classic chain, and even like 51% attack the Ethereum Classic chain, use legal threats against the Ethereum Classic chain. And this went against, deeply against my core principles, which is that basically, like, hey, we should respect other people's freedom. And if other people want to have their own chain, then, like, they should have their own chain. And like, sure, they're causing the ETH price to go down, but that's not something that we kind of have a right to complain about, because them causing our price to go down is not them attacking us. It's just people choosing to have coins on the Ethereum Classic side instead of having coins on the Ethereum side, and that's something that we're morally obligated to respect. But what happened was that a lot of people, and like I could even feel the kind of the psychological desire to go along with them within myself, and it just ended up going saying, like, no, this is an existential threat to the ecosystem, and we have to just forget all the principles, and we have to just go and try and destroy them. And I ended up eventually pretty kind of forcefully clamping down on these efforts and saying, like, no, the Ethereum Foundation is not going to sue those people. But the pressure was there, and seeing that pressure within a community that normally really values principles, like, that was something that really shook me, right? And so, like, basically and this is something that I ended up just seeing lots and lots of examples of kind of many times over, right? Basically, people and communities end up being at their worst and end up being kind of more willing to sacrifice their principles, being more willing to just forget about, not even care about whether they're doing things that are good or bad, in those situations where they kind of basically think that they're in some kind of existential threat. And the reality is that if someone in these cases, a lot of the time, when people think that they're under this existential threat, they're actually overrating how scary the threat is, and if they do nothing, in reality, things will probably be fine. But when you're within that situation, then no, it doesn't look that way. And often what happens is that one side feels threatened and they do something to attack back, and then the other side feels threatened, and you get this escalation, and then basically wars happen, right? And so, like, realizing that a lot of I guess the worst things happening in the world are kind of not the result of, like, basically psychology that's kind of comes from a completely different species, but realizing that it comes from a psychology that ultimately we're all susceptible to, has definitely been I guess one of my big shifts, and just understanding how like those aspects of how the world works and how kind of conflict in the world works.
Yeah, I think a lot of people view a lot of things as quite black and white, and I personally like to see things as much as I can as existing in a gray area, which I think is somewhat what you're saying, and I appreciate obviously you sharing all that. I appreciate you going well over the scheduled hour that we had on the calendar for today. This has been one of the most interesting conversations I've had, really. And I think a lot of people know that you're very smart, but my biggest takeaway from learning more about you in the last week and speaking with you today is that you're incredibly honest and just a very good guy. So it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I do want to give you the last word if there's anything else you'd like to say today. But most of all, just thank you so much for taking the time, and it's been awesome talking with you.
It was good to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about things, crypto or math or the different kinds of economics and philosophy more general. So I guess hope you have a good day.